The sprawling Donovan estate stretched endlessly, a labyrinth of manicured hedges and flowering vines that seemed to bloom with secrets. Ethan Parker's hands tightened around the handle of a garden spade, his crisp blue uniform a stark contrast to his true identity. A few weeks ago, he had been pacing the marble floors of his corporate office, piecing together evidence of embezzlement. Now, he stood in the sun-drenched gardens of his business partner, Carter Donovan, pretending to trim rose bushes. Ethan had always trusted his instincts, and they had rarely failed him. Carter's charm was polished, his reputation impeccable, but something in the numbers hadn't added up. Missing funds, odd transfers, and false invoices painted a picture of betrayal. Ethan wasn't just chasing stolen money. He was chasing justice. The estate exuded an air of decadence, but it didn't feel warm. It was cold, calculated, like the man who owned it. Carter Donovan was the kind of person who could smile through lies and walk away unscathed. His carefully curated life included every appearance of success: elegant soirees, an enviable property, and a daughter whose quiet grace contrasted sharply with her father's commanding presence. Ethan's assignment had begun smoothly enough. The Donovan family rarely paid much attention to the staff, which worked to his advantage. He spent hours in the gardens, trimming, weeding, and observing. Every now and then, he'd catch glimpses of Carter in the distance, always on the phone, always animated, as though sealing some elusive deal. Ethan knew that somewhere in this estate lay the answers he sought. His opportunity came late in the afternoon. While pruning a set of vines near the south end of the property, he noticed a structure partially hidden behind a cluster of tall oak trees. A greenhouse. Unlike the open, airy gardens, this building was locked and opaque, its frosted glass obscuring any view of what lay inside. Ethan's curiosity stirred. Why would Carter keep such a place locked? The greenhouse wasn't listed among the property's architectural features in the estate's public descriptions. Ethan leaned closer, noting the sturdy padlock on the door. He glanced over his shoulder, ensuring no one was watching. Then he crouched, letting his hand graze the damp soil beneath the vines. He would wait. Answers had a way of revealing themselves to those who paid attention. As he straightened, his gaze lingered on the greenhouse. It wasn't just a building. It was a puzzle piece, and Ethan was determined to complete the picture. The early morning sun cast a golden glow over the garden, and Ethan worked in quiet rhythm, his hands busy pruning a cluster of ivy along the pergola. The tranquility was broken by the faint sound of footsteps crunching over the gravel path. He looked up, and there she was, Emily Donovan. She moved with an air of elegance, yet there was something unspoken in her demeanor, a quiet weight in her steps. Her auburn hair framed a face that held both curiosity and caution. Dressed in a light summer dress, she seemed like she belonged to the garden as much as the roses that surrounded her. "You must be the new gardener," she said, her voice soft but steady. Ethan straightened and nodded, brushing dirt off his hands. "That's me, Jack Miller," he replied, using the name he'd carefully prepared for this ruse. She studied him for a moment, her hazel eyes sharp and discerning. "You're different from the others. Most of the staff don't bother much with this part of the garden. I like to keep things in order," Ethan said lightly. "There's a lot of life in this place, just needs a bit of care." Emily smiled faintly, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's more than my father gives it. He insists on perfection, but I doubt he's set foot in here for years." Ethan caught the undertone in her words, a hint of bitterness wrapped in politeness. "You seem to care about it, though," he said, gesturing toward the garden. She hesitated, then glanced at the small patch of wildflowers near the fence. "I do. I planted those when I was a kid. They're the only part of this place that feels free." Her honesty surprised him. She didn't fit the mold of a spoiled heiress. There was strength in her vulnerability, a quiet rebellion beneath her composed exterior. Ethan felt a twinge of guilt as he remembered his true purpose here. Their conversation was interrupted by her sudden change in tone. "Just so you know," Emily said, gesturing toward the greenhouse behind the trees, "that's off limits. My father doesn't like anyone near it." Ethan kept his expression neutral. "Understood." She nodded, lingering for a moment before walking away. As she disappeared down the path, Ethan noticed Carter standing at the balcony, watching him intently. The stakes were rising. Emily sat on the edge of the stone bench in the far corner of the garden, her hands idly tracing the grooves of the weathered seat. The morning's conversation with the new gardener lingered in her mind. Jack? No, Mr. Miller, as her father insisted on addressing all the staff, had been kind, listening without the usual polite disinterest she received from the household employees. It was rare for her to feel truly heard in a house so focused on appearances. Her gaze drifted toward the vibrant patch of wildflowers she had nurtured over the years. It was the one part of the estate where her father's influence felt absent, untouched by his relentless pursuit of perfection. Carter Donovan's plans for her life were as immaculately controlled as the hedges lining the pathways, pristine, calculated, and suffocating. Emily wanted something different. Freedom, a quiet life, her own flower shop, far away from the shadow of her father's domineering presence. Her daydreaming was interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Ethan, or Jack, as she knew him, approached, carrying a bucket of fresh soil. Thought this corner could use a bit of attention, he said, offering a warm smile. Emily blinked, surprised. Most of the gardeners don't bother with this area. Well, it looked like it could use some care, Ethan replied, kneeling near the wildflowers. Besides, I think it's worth the effort. Her lips quirked into a small smile. You're full of surprises. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, Ethan carefully removing weeds and Emily adjusting the placement of the flowers. He occasionally asked questions about the soil, her favorite flowers, or the history of the estate, but never probed too deeply. Emily found herself relaxing, her usual guarded demeanor softening. You have a good eye for this, Ethan said, glancing at her handiwork. Ever thought about doing this professionally? Emily hesitated, her fingers brushing a petal. I have. I dream of running my own shop, but my father has other plans. Ethan didn't press, sensing the weight of her words. Instead, he quietly admired her determination. She wasn't just surviving in her father's world. She was fighting to carve out a piece of it for herself. As the afternoon sun began to dip, Ethan excused himself and made his way toward the main house. Near the back entrance, he paused, hearing Carter's unmistakable voice on the phone. Make the transfer by Friday, Carter said, his tone sharp and urgent. I don't care how risky it is. Just get it done. Ethan's pulse quickened. The pieces of Carter's scheme were beginning to surface. Ethan adjusted his hat to shield his eyes from the mid-afternoon sun as he pushed the wheelbarrow toward the far edge of the garden. He wasn't alone. Claire Hudson, Carter Donovan's poised and efficient assistant, was walking briskly along the stone path nearby, clipboard in hand. She moved with purpose, but something about her demeanor caught Ethan's attention. Her sharp glances toward the house, her hurried pace. She was distracted, almost anxious. Pausing his work, Ethan observed as Claire stopped near the greenhouse, her hand hovering over the padlock. She appeared to check her surroundings before quickly scribbling something on her clipboard and slipping it into a folder. Moments later, she walked away without entering the structure. Ethan filed the scene in his mind. Claire clearly had a role beyond simple office duties, and whatever she was involved in, it seemed tied to the secrets Carter guarded so fiercely. Later, as Ethan trimmed a hedge near the wildflower patch, Emily approached, her expression tight. She carried a watering can but set it down with unnecessary force, spilling water onto the stone. Tough day? Ethan asked, keeping his tone light. Emily crossed her arms, leaning against the fence. You could say that. My father's decided I should attend another networking dinner next week. More meetings with people I couldn't care less about. Smiling through every second. Sounds exhausting, Ethan said, pausing his work. It is, she replied, her voice tinged with frustration. He doesn't see me as a person, just an accessory to his plans. Sometimes, I wonder if he even knows who I am. Her words hung in the air, and Ethan felt a pang of guilt. She was opening up to him, and yet he was withholding so much. Still, he couldn't let himself grow too close. His mission relied on keeping his distance. You seem to know yourself better than you think, Ethan said, carefully choosing his words. It takes strength to see beyond what others expect of you. Emily looked at him, her eyes softening. Thanks, Jack. That means more than you know. Later that evening, as the estate fell quiet, Ethan found his opportunity. Under the pretense of cleaning tools, he slipped into the greenhouse. The air was thick and humid, the scent of damp earth and fertilizer hanging heavily. Among the scattered pots and equipment, a discarded envelope caught his eye. He crouched to pick it up, noticing the faint but unmistakable stamp of an offshore bank's logo. Ethan's heart raced. This was no ordinary scrap of paper. It was a breadcrumb, one that could lead him straight to the truth. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden hues across the garden as Emily approached Ethan, her expression hesitant. She held a small notebook, her fingers nervously flipping its corners. "Jack," she said softly, drawing his attention. "I need a favor." Ethan set down his rake, intrigued by the unease in her tone. "What's on your mind?" Emily glanced toward the greenhouse, its locked doors looming behind the trellises. "There's a set of tools in there. Mine, actually. I used them when I was younger, but my father had them stored away. I'd like to get them back, but, well, you know how he is about that place." Ethan hesitated. Every instinct told him to tread carefully, but the opportunity to access the greenhouse was too valuable to ignore. "I'll help," he said, keeping his voice steady. "But we'll need to be quick." They waited until the estate quieted, slipping into the greenhouse as the last rays of daylight faded. Inside, the air was thick and earthy, filled with the faint hum of a ventilation system. Emily directed Ethan to a cabinet in the corner, its hinges rusted from disuse. "This is it," she said, kneeling to unlock it. Her hands trembled slightly, though she tried to hide it. While she rummaged through the tools, Ethan's eyes scanned the room. His attention was drawn to a cluttered desk against the far wall. Among the scattered documents was a manila file folder, its corner sticking out as though hastily tucked away. His heart quickened. "Got it," Emily said, holding up a trowel and a pair of pruning shears. She smiled, but her relief was short-lived. Footsteps echoed outside. "Emily?" Carter's voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. Panic flashed across her face. Ethan moved quickly, nudging her toward the side door. "Go," he whispered. "I'll handle this." She hesitated, but the urgency in his eyes propelled her into action. Once she was out of sight, Ethan grabbed a nearby broom and began sweeping the floor, feigning nonchalance as Carter entered. "What are you doing here?" Carter demanded, his gaze narrowing. "Cleaning up," Ethan said casually. "Figured it was overdue." Carter's eyes darted around the room, but he didn't press further. Instead, he turned and left, his footsteps heavy with suspicion. Later, Ethan retrieved the folder he'd glimpsed earlier. Inside were financial statements tied to overseas accounts, proof of Carter's deceit. As he tucked it away, one thought consumed him. The stakes had never been higher. The garden was alive with color, the sun casting dappled light through the canopy of trees. Ethan knelt in the flower bed, carefully loosening the soil around the roots of a blooming rose bush. Nearby, Emily worked alongside him, her hands dusted with dirt. Despite the quiet atmosphere, there was an ease between them that hadn't existed before. "This was always my favorite part of the estate," Emily said, breaking the silence. "It's the only place that feels real." Ethan glanced at her, noting the wistfulness in her tone. "Real how?" She paused, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "Everything else here is about appearances. Every dinner party, every conversation. But this?" She gestured to the flowers. "It doesn't care about what my father wants or expects. It just grows." Ethan leaned back on his heels, considering her words. "That's a rare perspective. Most people in your position might not even notice." Emily offered a faint smile. "I guess I've always been different. My mom used to say that." The mention of her mother shifted the mood slightly. Emily's fingers stilled as she stared at the soil. "She died when I was 10. It wasn't sudden. She was sick for a long time, but I still didn't see it coming. She was the only one who made me feel like I had a choice in life." Ethan hesitated, sensing the vulnerability in her words. "I'm sorry," Emily. That must have been hard. It was, she admitted, her voice soft. After she was gone, my father became relentless. Everything had to be perfect, me included. I think he blames me in a way. Ethan's chest tightened. He wanted to comfort her, but his own guilt held him back. Instead, he tried to relate. I didn't grow up with much. My parents worked hard, but money was always tight. Every decision felt like it came with stakes. I guess that's why I'm here now, trying to make sure the right people pay for their mistakes. Emily tilted her head, studying him. You're different, Jack. You don't seem like someone who belongs in a place like this. He laughed softly, masking his unease. Maybe I don't. As they worked in silence, Emily spoke again, almost absent-mindedly. You know, my father keeps all his important things in the safe in his office. He doesn't trust anything else. Ethan froze, his heart quickening. He kept his tone casual. A safe, huh? Must be important. Emily shrugged, unaware of the significance her words held. Ethan's mind raced, torn between his growing feelings for her and the knowledge that her trust might be the key to everything he was searching for. The house loomed large and silent as Ethan stood just beyond the garden's edge, his gaze fixed on the second-floor window of Carter Donovan's office. He'd pieced together enough to know the safe held critical evidence, but reaching it would require precision and Emily's help. The opportunity came during breakfast the next morning. Ethan found Emily near the greenhouse, her hands cupping a mug of tea as she stared at the horizon. She seemed lost in thought, but her expression softened when she noticed him. "Busy day?" he asked casually, leaning against the gate. "Always," she replied with a small laugh. "Though I wouldn't mind an excuse to get away from my father's endless to-do lists." Ethan seized the opening. "Actually, I could use a hand. There's a section of the garden near the east wall that's overgrown. Might need someone to keep Carter occupied while I sort it out. You think you can manage that?" Her brow furrowed slightly, and Ethan felt the weight of her suspicion, faint but growing. "That's a bit specific," she said. "Why does it matter if he's distracted?" Ethan shrugged, keeping his tone light. "Your dad's not exactly easygoing when it comes to staff wandering around. I'd rather not end up on his bad side for taking too long." Emily hesitated, then nodded. "Fair enough. He's got a meeting with Claire soon. I'll convince him to hold it in the dining room. That should give you some time." Ethan thanked her, though her lingering glance suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. As she walked toward the house, he felt the familiar tug of guilt, but he couldn't stop now. An hour later, Ethan found himself in Carter's office, the room darkened by heavy curtains. He moved quickly, his gloved hands skimming across the polished desk. The safe stood behind a framed portrait, just as Emily had described. He worked the combination with steady fingers, heart pounding with each click. The safe door swung open, revealing a ledger bound in dark leather. Flipping through its pages, Ethan's stomach churned. Transactions tied to offshore accounts, names of shell companies, evidence of Carter's sprawling corruption. Before he could close the safe, the sound of heels echoed in the hallway. Claire. Ethan's mind raced. He shoved the ledger into his jacket and quickly returned the office to its original state, slipping into the shadows just as the door creaked open. Claire stepped inside, her sharp eyes scanning the room. For a moment, she paused, her gaze lingering near the desk. Ethan held his breath, pressing himself against the wall. She moved toward the window, seeming to hesitate, before turning and leaving. He exhaled silently, waiting until her footsteps faded before slipping back into the corridor. As he descended the stairs, Emily was waiting near the garden. She raised an eyebrow as he approached. "That was fast," she said. Ethan forced a smile. "Turns out it wasn't as bad as I thought. Thanks for running interference." Emily studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Jack, you're hiding something." The statement hung between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Emily sighed, turning away. "If you want me to trust you, maybe start by trusting me." As she walked back toward the house, Ethan stood frozen, the ledger tucked beneath his arm. The walls of deception he'd built were beginning to crack, and Emily was on the other side, waiting for the truth. The Donovan estate was unrecognizable, bathed in golden light and adorned with silk banners and floral arrangements that seemed to stretch for miles. The charity event was in full swing, with guests dressed in their finest mingling under the glittering chandeliers in the grand hall. The sound of a string quartet floated through the air, mingling with the low hum of polite conversation. Ethan blended into the background, his gardener's uniform swapped for a plain suit that allowed him to pass unnoticed among the staff serving hors d'oeuvres and champagne. From his vantage point near the open French doors, he could observe the flow of the evening while remaining inconspicuous. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on Emily. She was breathtaking in a deep emerald dress that caught the light as she moved, her hair swept into an elegant updo. Yet, beneath her poised exterior, Ethan could sense her discomfort. She drifted between conversations, smiling politely but never lingering, like a bird searching for an escape route. Catching her eye across the room, Ethan gave a small nod, and she excused herself from the cluster of socialites surrounding her. She slipped through the French doors and into the garden, and Ethan followed at a distance. The garden was quiet, its usual stillness amplified by the muffled sounds of the party behind them. Emily stopped near the rose trellis, her fingers brushing one of the blooms. Ethan approached slowly, unsure if she wanted company. "You're quite the social butterfly," he teased, his tone light. Emily turned, a wry smile on her lips. "If butterflies could suffocate, maybe." Ethan chuckled softly, stepping closer. "I can see why you'd want to escape. It doesn't seem like your kind of crowd." "It isn't," she admitted, her gaze drifting to the sky. "It's all just a performance." Smiling, nodding, pretending to care about causes they'll forget by tomorrow. For a moment, they stood in silence, the tension of the evening fading as the cool night air wrapped around them. Ethan hesitated, then spoke, his voice quieter. "You don't have to be part of it, you know? You can choose something else." Emily looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "It's not that simple. My father. He expects me to play my role. What about what you expect?" Ethan asked, stepping closer. "What do you want, Emily?" Her breath caught, and for a moment, she seemed ready to answer. But the words remained unspoken as their eyes locked. Ethan's resolve wavered as he saw the vulnerability in her gaze, the wall she had carefully built beginning to crumble. Slowly, as if pulled by an invisible force, they moved closer. Ethan's hand brushed hers, and she didn't pull away. Their connection hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. But just as the moment deepened, Emily stepped back. "I can't," she said softly, her voice tinged with regret. "Not like this." Ethan nodded, his own guilt bubbling to the surface. He couldn't blame her. After all, his own secrets were the barrier between them. "I understand." Before either could say more, a figure emerged from the shadows of the garden path. Carter Donovan strode toward the far side of the garden, his sharp profile illuminated briefly by the glow of a nearby lantern. Ethan's eyes narrowed as he saw an envelope clutched in Carter's hand. "Stay here," Ethan whispered to Emily, his voice firm. Without waiting for her reply, he moved stealthily through the hedges, keeping a safe distance from Carter. Near a secluded fountain, Carter stopped, glancing around before handing the envelope to a man in a dark suit. The exchange was quick, the men's words too quiet to hear, but the urgency in their body language was unmistakable. The man tucked the envelope into his jacket and disappeared into the shadows. Carter lingered for a moment, his expression tense, before returning to the party. Ethan waited until the garden was still again before returning to Emily. She looked at him, concern etched across her face. "What happened?" He shook his head, forcing a calm tone. "Nothing you need to worry about." Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't push. Instead, she reached for his arm. "Jack, I mean it. If you're in some kind of trouble, you can trust me." Ethan's chest tightened at her words, the weight of his deception growing heavier. "I will," he said, though he knew it was a promise he couldn't yet keep. As they returned to the party, the distance between them felt both greater and smaller than ever before. The dance of deception continued, but the stakes were rising, and the cost of the truth loomed ever closer. The next morning, Ethan found Claire in the estate's library, seated at the grand oak desk with a stack of papers spread before her. She didn't acknowledge him as he entered, but her fingers paused over her pen when she noticed his reflection in the glass cabinet across from her. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone sharp, though she didn't look up. Ethan closed the door softly behind him, stepping further into the room. "We need to talk." Claire finally raised her eyes, her expression a careful mask of indifference. "I'm not sure what you mean." "I think you do," Ethan replied, his voice steady. He gestured to the papers on the desk. "You've been covering for Carter, or at least helping him keep things buried. But I don't think you're in this as deep as he is. If you were, you wouldn't look so concerned every time he gives an order." Claire's lips pressed into a thin line, her fingers tightening around the pen. "You don't know what you're talking about, don't I?" Ethan took a calculated step closer. "I saw you hesitate at the greenhouse. I saw the envelope exchange in the garden, and I know you've seen the ledger. Carter's got you tangled in this mess, but it doesn't have to end badly for you." Her mask faltered for just a moment, a flicker of fear crossing her face. "And why would you care what happens to me?" "Because I need the truth," Ethan said plainly. "And you need a way out." Claire stared at him for a long moment, the tension between them heavy. Finally, she exhaled, her shoulders sagging slightly. "You don't understand. If I say anything, if I even hint that I know what he's doing, he'll destroy me. Carter doesn't make threats lightly, and neither do I," Ethan said, his voice low but firm. "Help me, and I'll make sure you're protected. Stay silent, and you'll go down with him when this all unravels." Claire's jaw tightened, but she nodded faintly. "Fine. What do you want to know?" Meanwhile, Emily wandered the estate in search of Ethan. She'd caught him leaving the library earlier, his expression guarded. He had been distant since the charity event, his usual easy demeanor replaced with a quiet intensity that set her on edge. She finally found him near the garden, pacing by the trellis as though lost in thought. When he saw her approach, he stopped, but he didn't smile. "Jack," she began, her voice hesitant. "What's going on?" "You've been different lately." "Just busy," Ethan said, forcing a small smile. "There's a lot to take care of around here." "You mean a lot more than just the garden," Emily countered, her tone sharper than she intended. "You're always watching, always listening. And last night, you disappeared into the shadows like you were following someone." Ethan's silence was deafening, and Emily felt her chest tighten. "You're hiding something," she said, her voice quieter now. "And I need to know what it is." Ethan hesitated, the weight of her gaze pressing down on him. "Emily, it's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is," she demanded, stepping closer. "Who are you, Jack? Really?" He looked away, his jaw clenched. Every part of him wanted to tell her the truth, to end the charade. But he knew what was at stake. If she knew who he really was, she might hate him. Not just for the lies, but for the danger it would bring to her life. "Emily," he said softly, "I can't explain everything right now. But I promise you, I'm not here to hurt you." She crossed her arms, her frustration boiling over. "That's not good enough. You want me to trust you, but you won't give me a reason to." "Because I can't," Ethan admitted, his voice cracking under the strain. "Not yet." Her eyes searched his face, and for a moment, her expression softened. But then she stepped back, shaking her head. "You're just like him," she said bitterly. "Always holding the truth over my head." Ethan flinched at the comparison, but before he could respond, Emily turned and walked away, her figure disappearing through the garden path. He stood frozen, the sound of her footsteps fading into silence. The walls around him were crumbling, and for the first time, he wasn't sure he could hold them up. Ethan sat on the stone bench in the garden, the cool evening air swirling around him. The estate was quiet, the only sounds coming from the faint rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp of crickets. He stared at the envelope in his hands, proof of Carter's betrayal, but also the symbol of his own lies. He knew what he had to do, even if it meant risking everything. Emily appeared moments later, her expression guarded. She approached cautiously, stopping a few steps away. "You asked to see me," she said flatly, her voice devoid of the warmth it once carried. Ethan stood, meeting her gaze. I need to tell you the truth, Emily. About everything. She folded her arms, her jaw tightening. Finally, he took a deep breath. My name isn't Jack Miller. It's Ethan Parker. Emily's eyes widened, and she took a step back. Ethan Parker? The Ethan Parker? You're Carter's business partner. Yes, he admitted, his voice steady. And I'm here because I believe your father has been stealing from our company. Millions of dollars, funneled through offshore accounts and shell companies. Her expression shifted from shock to anger. So, what? You lied to me? Pretended to be someone else just to… What? Use me to get to him? No, it's not like that, Ethan said quickly. At first, yes, I came here to gather evidence. But then I met you and everything changed. Emily laughed bitterly. Changed? You mean you decided to keep lying to me, just in a different way? Ethan stepped closer, his voice softening. Emily, I didn't want to involve you in this. I didn't want you to get hurt. But your father, he's not who you think he is. I know he's controlling, she said, her tone sharp. I know he's not a saint. But stealing? That doesn't sound like him. Ethan hesitated, then reached into his jacket and pulled out the ledger he'd taken from Carter's office. He held it out to her. This is the proof. Transfers, fake companies, names of people he's paid off. He's built a web of lies, and it's all in here. Emily stared at the ledger, her hands trembling as she took it. She flipped through the pages, her expression shifting from disbelief to horror. This can't be real, she whispered. It is, Ethan said. And there's more. Claire told me that Carter has been using threats to keep people quiet. He's willing to do whatever it takes to protect himself. Emily looked up, her eyes brimming with tears. Why are you telling me this now? Why not keep lying? Because you deserve the truth, Ethan said, his voice firm. And because I need your help. He trusts you, Emily. You can get close to him in ways I can't. She hesitated, the weight of his words settling over her. Finally, she nodded, though her expression was filled with pain. I'll help you. But this doesn't mean I forgive you. I don't expect you to, Ethan said quietly. But thank you. Later that night, Emily sat in her room, the ledger open on her desk. She couldn't bring herself to look at it again. Her mind raced with memories of her father, moments of kindness overshadowed by years of control and manipulation. Feeling restless, she began sifting through a small chest that had belonged to her mother, tucked away in the corner of her room. She pulled out old letters, photographs, and keepsakes, her heart aching with each item she touched. Then she found it, a sealed envelope with her mother's handwriting on the front. It was addressed to her, but had never been given to her. Frowning, Emily opened it and began to read. The letter was heartfelt, filled with love and advice for a future Emily her mother would never see. But one line near the end made her breath catch. If anything happens to me, know that it wasn't an accident. Trust your instincts, Emily. You are stronger than he thinks. Emily's hands shook as she reread the words, her mother's meaning sinking in. Was her father involved in her mother's death? The idea felt impossible, yet the evidence of his deception was mounting. She clutched the letter tightly, tears streaming down her face. The door creaked open, and Ethan stepped inside cautiously. Emily? She looked up, her expression a mix of anguish and determination. My mother. She knew something. She warned me. Ethan frowned, stepping closer. What do you mean? Emily handed him the letter, her fingers trembling. She said it wasn't an accident, that I shouldn't trust him. Ethan read the letter, his face darkening. This changes everything. Emily stood, her resolve hardening. If my father had something to do with her death, I'll help you bring him down. But I need to know everything, Ethan. No more secrets. Ethan met her gaze, nodding solemnly. No more secrets. The storm rolled in swiftly, dark clouds swallowing the late afternoon sun. Rain lashed against the windows of the Donovan estate, and the sound of distant thunder echoed through its halls. Inside, Emily sat in her room, staring at the ledger and her mother's letter side by side on the desk. The weight of both pressed heavily on her chest, leaving her restless and unsure. Her mind was at war. For years, She had justified her father's control as his way of protecting her after her mother's death. But now, the veneer of safety was cracking, and she couldn't ignore the darkness that seeped through. Still, doubt lingered. Was it possible she didn't know him at all? A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Ethan stepped inside, his expression serious. His presence had become a strange source of comfort, even as trust between them remained fragile. "We need to act tonight," he said, his voice low but urgent. "There's more in the safe. Something bigger than the ledger." Claire hinted that he keeps documents that could connect all the dots. Emily turned to face him, her brow furrowing. "And how do you plan to get in? He's always near the office, and the safe has a secondary lock." "It's impossible." "Not if we create a distraction," Ethan replied, a plan already forming. "The storm gives us cover. You could draw him out, keep him busy, while I handle the safe." Her stomach twisted. "You're asking me to lie to my father, to trick him. I'm asking you to help me stop him from hurting more people," Ethan said firmly. "You know what he's capable of, Emily. This might be our only chance." Her lips pressed into a thin line, torn between the growing trust she felt for Ethan and the lingering loyalty she held for her father. Finally, she nodded. "Fine, but if this goes wrong—" "It won't," Ethan assured her. "I'll make sure of it." Hours later, the storm was in full force. Rain pounded against the glass, and flashes of lightning illuminated the darkened halls. Emily stood near the library, her hands clammy as she rehearsed her part of the plan. When Carter approached, his expression already laced with suspicion, she forced a smile. "I was hoping we could talk," she said, keeping her voice steady. "There's something about the charity event I wanted to run by you." Carter narrowed his eyes but nodded. "Make it quick." As Emily led him toward the dining room, her heart raced. Every step felt heavier than the last, but she pushed forward, keeping her father engaged with a fabricated story about potential donors. The weight of her deception was suffocating, but she reminded herself of the greater purpose. Meanwhile, Ethan slipped into the office, his movements swift and precise. The storm provided perfect cover, masking the creak of the floorboards and the soft click of the safe's dial. His fingers worked methodically, guided by the code Claire had provided. The first lock clicked open, and he carefully pulled the door ajar. Inside were stacks of documents, bound files, and a small black notebook. He quickly scanned the contents, his heart pounding as he recognized names, account numbers, and transactions. All damning evidence that painted a clear picture of Carter's web of corruption. As he reached for the notebook, a faint creak behind him froze him in place. He turned slowly, and his breath caught. Claire stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "You don't have much time," she said in a whisper. "Hurry." Ethan nodded, tucking the notebook into his jacket before closing the safe and resetting the lock. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Don't thank me," Claire replied, her voice bitter. "Just finish this." Back in the dining room, Emily felt the pressure building as Carter's questions turned sharper. "Why are you suddenly so interested in the donors?" he asked, his tone skeptical. "I just want to make sure the event had the right impact," Emily said, her voice faltering slightly. "Is that so strange?" Carter leaned back in his chair, his gaze piercing. "You've been acting different lately. Distracted. Is there something you're not telling me?" Emily's pulse quickened, but before she could respond, an ear-splitting crack of thunder shook the house and the lights flickered. "I should check on the staff," Carter said abruptly, rising from his seat. "Stay here." Panic set in as Emily realized where he was headed. She waited a moment before following, her footsteps light against the marble floor. When she reached the office, she found Carter standing by the door, his hand gripping the knob. "Emily," he said, his voice cold. "What are you doing here?" She froze, her mind racing for an excuse. I thought I heard something. I was just checking." Carter's eyes narrowed, his suspicion deepening. "The office is off limits. You know that." As he turned the knob, Ethan stepped out from behind the door, his face calm despite the danger. "Sir," Ethan said evenly, "I thought I heard something too. I came to check it out." Carter's gaze darted between them, and the tension in the air was palpable. "What is going on here?" he demanded. Emily opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. The fracture in their loyalties had been exposed, and the fallout was inevitable. The door slammed shut behind Carter, his angry footsteps fading into the distance. Emily leaned against the wall, her hands trembling as she tried to steady her breathing. Ethan stood nearby, his gaze fixed on her, concern etched into his face. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, stepping closer. Emily nodded, but her voice cracked as she spoke. "No, I'm not. He's never looked at me like that before." Like he, she stopped herself, shaking her head. "I've seen him angry, but this was different." Ethan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, but his own tension was evident. "You don't have to face him alone, Emily. You don't have to face any of this alone." She looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You don't understand. I spent my whole life convincing myself that he wasn't a bad person, just a controlling one. But now—" Her voice trailed off as a tear escaped, and Ethan instinctively brushed it away with his thumb. "Now you see the truth," he finished for her. "I know it's hard, but it's better to face it now than to keep living in his shadow." Emily's breath hitched, her emotions swirling in a storm she could no longer contain. "You don't get it, Ethan. He's my father. No matter how much I hate what he's done, some part of me will always want to believe there's good in him." Ethan hesitated, his heart aching for her. "I know it's not easy to break away from someone you've depended on your whole life, but he's not the man you thought he was. You have a choice now, Emily, to let him control you or to stand for what's right." She wiped her face, straightening her posture. "And what happens if standing for what's right means losing everything?" "Then you gain yourself," Ethan said, his voice firm. "You're stronger than he ever gave you credit for, and I see it every time you stand up for yourself." Emily blinked, surprised by the intensity in his words. "You really believe that?" "I do," he said without hesitation. "And I'll be here with you, no matter what happens." Later that evening, as Emily mulled over their conversation, Ethan met Claire in the library. Her expression was tight, her demeanor sharper than usual. "He knows," she said bluntly, her voice low. "Carter's figured out something's off, and he's not waiting around to see how much you've uncovered. He's planning to leave the country soon." Ethan's stomach dropped. "With the money?" Claire nodded. "Every last dollar. He's made arrangements for a private jet, and he's moving assets as we speak." "How long do we have?" Ethan asked urgently. "Not long," Claire said. "A day, maybe two. If you're going to act, it has to be now." Ethan's jaw clenched as the weight of the situation sank in. He glanced toward the garden, where Emily stood under the moonlight, her silhouette framed by the soft glow of the estate lights. "It's time," he said quietly. "We end this." The morning sun cast long shadows across the Donovan estate, but the air inside the house was electric with tension. Ethan stood by the large windows of the library, his jaw set as he reviewed the plan with Emily and Claire. The ledger and incriminating documents were spread across the table, alongside a laptop with a scheduled link for a live-streamed meeting. "This is our best shot," Ethan said, his voice low but steady. "If we expose him during the board meeting, it'll be public and undeniable. He won't have time to cover his tracks." Emily nodded, though her hands were clenched tightly in her lap. "What if he tries to spin it?" "He's good at that. That's where you come in," Ethan replied, meeting her eyes. "You know him better than anyone. You can call him out on his lies, throw him off balance. It has to be you." Emily's heart raced, but she straightened her posture. "I'll do it." Claire leaned forward, her tone curt. "The meeting starts in 20 minutes. Once he realizes what's happening, he'll lose it. You need to stay calm, no matter what." Ethan glanced at Claire. "And you?" "I'll be watching the servers to make sure nothing goes offline. If he tries to pull the plug, I'll keep the feed running," she replied. Ethan placed a hand on Emily's shoulder. "Are you ready?" She exhaled shakily. "Ready or not, it's time." 15 minutes later, they gathered in the study where Carter had set up his video call with the board members. Ethan and Emily hid just out of view, waiting for their moment. Carter was seated at his desk, his polished demeanor firmly in place as he greeted the attendees on the screen. "Gentlemen," Carter said smoothly, let's begin. Today's agenda is focused on the upcoming financial projections and our recent expansions. Ethan nodded to Claire, who pressed a button on the laptop. A small icon in the corner indicated the live stream was active. The world beyond the board members was now watching. Ethan stepped into the room, his presence immediate and commanding. "Sorry to interrupt, Carter, but I think you're forgetting something." Carter's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "What the hell are you doing here?" Emily followed behind Ethan, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "He's here to make sure everyone sees the truth." The board members on the screen exchanged confused glances. "What is going on?" one of them demanded. Ethan held up the ledger. "This is what's going on. Carter Donovan has been siphoning millions from the company, funneling it through offshore accounts and shell corporations." Carter's face turned crimson, but his voice remained dangerously calm. "That's a bold accusation, Parker. Care to back it up?" Ethan flipped the ledger open, pointing to specific entries. "Here's the evidence: fake invoices, unauthorized transfers, and payments to individuals who don't exist. Your signature is on every single page." The board members murmured in disbelief, but Carter's mask didn't slip. "This is ridiculous," he said with a forced laugh. "You think you can barge in here with fabricated documents and destroy my reputation? I'll have you arrested for trespassing and slander." "That won't work," Ethan countered, "because this meeting isn't just for the board. It's being streamed live. The public is seeing everything." Carter's composure cracked, and his gaze shifted to Emily. "You," he spat. "You let him in on this, didn't you?" "My own daughter." Emily stepped forward, her voice trembling but resolute. "I had to. You're not the man I thought you were, Dad. You've lied to me, controlled me, and now I know you've stolen from people who trusted you." Carter rose from his chair, his anger boiling over. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You've destroyed this family, Emily." "No, Dad," she said, her voice breaking. "You destroyed it, and I won't let you hurt anyone else." Carter's eyes blazed with fury, and he turned on Ethan. "You think you can get away with this? I'll make sure the authorities know exactly who you are and what you've done here." Ethan didn't flinch. "Go ahead. I'll happily explain why I was here and how I uncovered everything you've been hiding." Carter lunged at Ethan, his fist connecting with his jaw. The sudden attack sent Ethan staggering, but he quickly recovered, blocking Carter's next swing. The two men grappled, knocking over a chair and scattering papers across the floor. "Stop it!" Emily shouted, her voice piercing through the chaos. She stepped between them, her hands outstretched. "This isn't going to fix anything." Carter froze, his chest heaving as he glared at Ethan. "You've ruined everything," he growled. "No, Dad," Emily said firmly. "You did this to yourself. It's over." The confrontation ended with the arrival of security personnel, alerted by Claire. They escorted Carter out of the study as he continued to hurl threats, his voice fading as he was taken away. Ethan turned to Emily, his face bruised but determined. "You were incredible," he said softly. Emily's shoulders sagged, the weight of the moment finally catching up to her. "I didn't feel incredible. I felt terrified." "And you still stood up to him," Ethan said. "That takes more courage than anything I've ever done." Claire entered the room, her expression unreadable. The feed stayed live. Everyone saw. The board will have no choice but to act. Emily looked at the laptop, the faces of the stunned board members still on the screen. "What happens now?" she asked. "They'll freeze his accounts, investigate the evidence," Ethan replied. "And Carter will face the consequences." Emily nodded, her gaze distant. "Good." As the storm of emotions began to settle, Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder. "You've done more than anyone could have asked, Emily. This is the beginning of something better. For you, for everyone." She looked up at him, her resolve returning. "I hope so." The sound of sirens grew louder as the police vehicles pulled up to the Donovan estate, their flashing lights cutting through the fading daylight. Inside the study, the aftermath of the confrontation lingered heavily in the air. The overturned chair, scattered papers, and the faint smear of blood on Ethan's lip told the story of a fight that had left more than physical scars. Ethan sat on the edge of the desk, His hand pressed to his side where Carter's unexpected shove had sent him crashing into a cabinet. He winced but waved off Emily's concerned look. "I'm fine," he assured her, though the strain in his voice betrayed him. Emily stood nearby, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her face was pale, her expression torn between relief and guilt. "This wasn't supposed to happen like this," she murmured. Ethan straightened, forcing himself to focus. "It was never going to be easy, but it's done now. The evidence is out there, and your father can't hide anymore." The door opened abruptly, and Claire stepped inside. "The police are here," she said briskly. "They want to speak to both of you." Emily's stomach churned as she nodded, but before she could move, Ethan spoke. "I'll go first. You've already done enough." She reached out, her hand brushing his arm. "No, Ethan. We'll face this together." In the grand foyer, the lead detective approached, a stern man with graying hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Ethan Parker?" he asked, glancing between the two of them. "That's me," Ethan said, stepping forward. "I have the evidence you need to build a case against Carter Donovan. It's all here." He handed over the ledger and the black notebook, their damning contents meticulously cataloged. The detective flipped through the materials, his expression unreadable. "This is substantial. But you understand, Mr. Parker, that entering this property under false pretenses complicates matters." "I do," Ethan said evenly. "But I'm willing to face the consequences if it means stopping Carter." Emily stepped forward, her voice firm despite her fear. "If anyone's to blame, it's me. I helped him. I knew what my father was doing, and I couldn't stand by anymore." The detective regarded her carefully. "That's not your decision to make, Miss Donovan. But your cooperation will be noted." As the officers moved to apprehend Carter, he fought against their grip, his voice echoing through the hall. "This is a mistake. They're framing me. You'll regret this." Emily watched, her heart heavy. Despite everything, he was still her father, and the sight of him being dragged away was almost too much to bear. "Almost. I'm sorry," she whispered under her breath, unsure if the words were for him or herself. After the chaos subsided, Emily and Ethan sat together in the now quiet garden. The night had fallen, the stars scattered across the sky like distant beacons of hope. Ethan leaned back on the bench, wincing as he adjusted his position. "You should let someone look at that," Emily said softly, gesturing to his side. "I will," he replied. "Just needed a moment to breathe." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the evening settling over them. Finally, Emily spoke. "I've been thinking about what happens next." Ethan turned his head to look at her, his expression curious. "What do you mean?" "My inheritance," she said, her voice steady but filled with resolve. "I can't keep it, not after what he's done. That money doesn't belong to me. It belongs to the people he stole it from." Ethan's brows furrowed. "Emily, you don't have to do that. You've already given up so much." She shook her head. "It's the right thing to do. If I keep it, I'll always feel like a part of him is still controlling me. This is how I move forward." Ethan reached for her hand, his touch gentle but firm. "That's a big decision. But if it's what you need to do, I'll support you." Emily met his gaze, her eyes shining with a mix of gratitude and determination. "It's not about need. It's about making things right." The next morning, Emily met with the lawyers handling her father's affairs. She explained her decision, insisting that the funds be returned to the victims of Carter's schemes. The lawyers were hesitant, warning her of the financial strain it might cause, but she didn't waver. "This isn't about me," she said firmly. "It's about undoing the harm my father caused." Word of her actions spread quickly, earning her both praise and scrutiny. But for the first time in years, Emily felt free. Back at the estate, Ethan packed his belongings, preparing to leave now that his mission was complete. Emily found him in the garden, her steps hesitant as she approached. "You're leaving," she said, more a statement than a question. Ethan nodded. "The work here is done. I don't have a reason to stay." Emily bit her lip, her emotions swirling. "What if I asked you to stay?" He turned to face her fully, his expression softening. "Emily, this was never just about Carter. You know that." "I do," she said quietly. But I don't want to do this alone. Ethan stepped closer, his hand brushing against hers. You're not alone. You never were. They stood in silence, the unspoken connection between them stronger than ever. For the first time, neither of them felt the need to fill the silence with words. Their bond had been tested, and what remained was unshakable. The morning sun filtered through the windows of a small, bustling flower shop tucked in the corner of the town square. Emily stood behind the counter, her hands deftly arranging a bouquet of fresh blooms. The fragrance of lavender, roses, and eucalyptus filled the air, mingling with the soft chatter of customers and the faint melody of a local radio station. It had been 3 months since her father's arrest, and life had transformed in ways Emily couldn't have imagined. The Donovan name, once a symbol of power and control, had taken on a new meaning, one of redemption and hope. With her inheritance forfeited, she'd poured her remaining resources and energy into opening the shop, a lifelong dream she'd almost given up on. "Excuse me," a customer interrupted, pulling Emily from her thoughts. "These peonies are stunning. Could you add them to the arrangement?" "Of course," Emily replied with a smile, slipping into the rhythm of her new life. The bell above the door chimed, signaling another visitor. When she glanced up, she froze. Ethan stood in the doorway, a small package tucked under his arm and a warm smile lighting up his face. "I heard this place has the best flowers in town," he said, stepping inside. Emily's heart fluttered, but she masked it with a playful roll of her eyes. "Oh, you're back to charm me with bad pickup lines now?" He chuckled, setting the package on the counter. "Maybe, but I also wanted to see how you're settling in." Emily gestured to the shop around them, her pride evident. "It's small, but it's mine. For the first time, I feel free." Ethan nodded, his gaze soft. "You look it." After the shop closed for the day, Ethan lingered as Emily swept the floor, the quiet moment between them feeling as natural as the flowers that surrounded them. When she finished, he handed her the package. "What's this?" she asked, curiosity sparking in her eyes. "Open it," he said. She carefully unwrapped the paper, revealing a small wooden box. Inside, nestled in soft linen, were several packets of seeds labeled in Ethan's neat handwriting. Wildflowers, daisies, sunflowers. Her breath caught as she realized their significance. "These are," she began, but he interrupted gently. "Your favorite flowers," he said. "I thought they might make this place feel even more like yours." Emily stared at him, her emotions swirling. "Ethan, it's perfect. Thank you. You've built something incredible here." "Emily," he said, his voice sincere. "I just wanted to add a little piece of what you've always loved." Over the following weeks, the seeds Ethan gifted her sprouted in a small garden she'd cultivated behind the shop. It became a space for reflection, a reminder of how far she'd come. Ethan visited often, helping her tend to the plants and adding his signature humor to the work. Their relationship blossomed, free of the shadows that had once loomed over them. They took long walks, shared quiet dinners, and laughed about the chaos that had brought them together. But amidst the lightness, there were moments of deep honesty. One evening, as they sat on a bench in the garden, Ethan turned to her, his expression serious. "Do you ever regret it? Walking away from everything?" Emily thought for a moment before shaking her head. "No, there are times I miss the idea of family, but what I had with my father, it wasn't real. What I've built now is." Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I've thought a lot about what I did. The lies, the risks. I wonder if there was another way." "You did what you had to," Emily said gently. "And because of that, I found the courage to do what I had to." Her words eased the tension in his shoulders, and he reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. "I'm glad we found each other in all of this." "So am I," she said softly, leaning her head against his shoulder. By the end of summer, Emily's shop had become a beloved part of the community. Regulars stopped by for flowers and conversation, and the garden out back flourished into a vibrant display of color. Ethan often joked that it was the happiest-looking corner of town. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across the flowers, Ethan brought a bottle of wine to the shop. They sat in the garden, the warm glow of string lights illuminating their faces. "To new beginnings," Ethan said, raising his glass. Emily smiled, her eyes shining with happiness. "To freedom." As they clinked glasses, the weight of the past felt far away, replaced by the steady promise of a future built on trust, resilience, and love. The early autumn breeze carried a crispness that hinted at the changing seasons. The garden behind Emily's flower shop was alive with vibrant colors, sunflowers reaching toward the sky, wildflowers dancing in the gentle wind, and the delicate daisies swaying softly. Emily knelt by a small patch of soil, carefully planting a new row of tulip bulbs for the spring. Ethan was beside her, holding a watering can and watching her with quiet admiration. His sleeves were rolled up, and a streak of dirt smudged his cheek, a detail Emily found endearing. "You're getting better at this," she teased, glancing at him as she pressed the bulb into the soil. "Don't sound so surprised," Ethan replied with a grin. "I've had a great teacher." Emily laughed softly, shaking her head. "I never thought I'd see the day when Ethan Parker, corporate powerhouse, would be out here planting tulips. Life's full of surprises," he said, his voice tinged with warmth. "And honestly, I wouldn't trade this for anything." They worked in companionable silence for a while, the garden surrounding them feeling like a world of its own. It had become a sanctuary, not just for Emily but for the community, a place where people came to breathe, to reconnect, and to find a bit of peace. The shop had flourished in the months since its opening, not just as a business but as a symbol of resilience. Emily's decision to return her inheritance had inspired others to come forward and demand justice for Carter's crimes. The ripple effect was undeniable. Policies were being re-examined, and systemic changes were beginning to take shape. Emily had received letters from families who'd regained their savings, from employees who no longer feared for their livelihoods, and from strangers who found hope in her story. She kept them in a small box under the counter, a reminder of the good that had come from so much pain. Ethan had his own share of letters, legal notices, and inquiries as the investigation into Carter's fraud continued. But for the first time, the weight of such things didn't crush him. He'd made peace with his choices, knowing they had brought something beautiful into the world. As the sun dipped lower, casting a golden glow over the garden, Ethan set down the watering can and leaned against the fence, watching Emily finish the last row of planting. "You've done something incredible here, you know," he said. Emily sat back on her heels, brushing her hands against her jeans. "We did something incredible," she corrected, meeting his eyes. "I wouldn't have gotten here without you." Ethan smiled, his gaze soft. "I think you would have. You've always been stronger than you realized." She stood, wiping her hands on a towel before stepping closer to him. "And you've shown me how to believe in myself." For a moment, they stood there, the garden around them a testament to their shared journey. The flowers, the soil, the life they'd nurtured. It all spoke of growth, healing, and a future built on truth. "Do you ever think about what's next?" Emily asked, her voice quiet. "All the time," Ethan admitted. "But for the first time in a long while, I'm not afraid of it." She smiled, leaning against the fence beside him. "I never thought I'd be able to say that either. But this feels right." "It is," Ethan said, his voice steady. He reached out, his fingers brushing hers. "And wherever life takes us, I'll be here. With you." Emily turned to him, her eyes shining with emotion. "Promise." "Promise," he said, his tone filled with certainty. As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, they stood together, the garden a living symbol of their journey from deception and pain to truth and hope. The world around them continued to heal, just as they had, and for the first time in years, they felt free.